Well, good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening to everyone. Welcome to this GOMO Learning webinar about from tool selection to measurement, 6 steps to e-learning authoring success. Thank you all very much for tuning in today. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes, but just to get us going, you'll be able to ask questions as we go along, but we've got so many people registered today, we're not going to be able to unmute you, unfortunately, but instead you're going to find the questions panel in your GoToWebinar box, and you'll be able to ask questions through there. So just to get us used to using that, if those of you who are familiar with other GOMO webinars, we do what we like to call our global weather report. So if you could just find that question box and just type in where you're from and what the weather is like there, and we'll see how things are going around the world. And just to start things off, so I'm Hugh Edwards from GOMO Learning. I'm here in Brighton on England's south coast, and we have sunshine and occasional showers here. And great, we have Stephen here, beautiful 80 here in South Florida. We're very envious. And Sarah, you're in Wisconsin, and it's cloudy there. And also welcome to everybody who's just tuning in. I see that we have lots of people coming here. And I see sunny-ish in Sheffield in the north of England here. So if you're just joining us, welcome. We'll be starting off at the top of the hour. And just to get us going and used to using the question panel, where you'll be able to ask questions as the presentation continues, maybe you could just let us know where you're from and what the weather is like there, so we can get a bit of a global weather report going on here. So Shannon in Toronto saying it's sunny. And I can see that we have lots more people joining, and we will be starting in just a couple of minutes. Again, for those of you who are just tuning in, welcome to you all. And we'll be using the question panel to for you to be able to ask questions and add comments and share your experiences. And to get us used to that, if you could just find the question panel and just let us know where you're from and what the weather is like with you. Okay, we have a few more coming in here. I'll have more people from Florida, and it's still beautiful and sunny in Florida. Just making the rest of us very envious here. And we have more people joining. We're just going to wait another minute or so before we start. So welcome to everyone who's tuning in. Just before we start the webinar, very shortly, we're just asking people to find the question panel in the GoToWebinar panel, where you'll be able to ask questions, share your experiences. Just let us know what the weather's like where you are. And I can see that we're getting some further reports here, again from other parts of England. Seems to be mixed bunch of sunny with showers. Well, it is that time of year over here. And we're just going to give it another minute or so because we can see lots of people just joining us right now. So if you have joined us, do feel free to find the question panel where you'll be able to ask questions as we progress, and just let us know where you're from and what the weather is like where you are. Okay, great. Seems to be a fairly big divide across the Atlantic here. Tend to have great sunshine in the east coast of the US and a mixed bunch here. And welcome, Hamish, from Reading in England. And we can see just a few more people starting to join. And welcome, Eduardo. Yes, you're saying that you're from Italy with the virus emergency. Yep, we're all thinking of you over there, and it sounds as if you're having a very difficult time. So we really appreciate you taking the time today to tune in to this. And welcome to David from Denmark. And okay, so we still have some people joining us. But I think that we've got quite a lot to cover today, so I think that we're going to make a start. So I'm going to hand you over to Simon Waldron, who's going to do a few introductions today. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Hugh. And as Hugh said, really appreciate all the questions being answered here around the weather. It's fantastic to hear that it's beautiful on the Californian coast. I'm here, Simon Waldron. I'm from Sheffield, and we're going to start the introductions into where we're going to be going with this webinar. So again, just to reiterate, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is going to be from tool selection to measurement, and here today we'll cover the 6 steps to e-learning authoring success. As I stated, I'm Simon Waldron. I'll be facilitating today alongside my colleague, Hugh Edwards. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Very much like you've just been participating with the weather reports, you'll have an opportunity to submit questions again within that panel. So please use that throughout the presentation. And also, we'll be holding a series of polls, and during those polls, we'll ask you to respond to certain questions that are asked around there by selecting the appropriate response and clicking submit. So thank you very much, and without further ado, let's get going to the first slide. So over to you, Hugh.
Thank you, Simon. I just wanted to explain a bit about who we are, where we've come from, and where we're gathering this experience from that we're going to be sharing with you today. So in Gomo Learning, we're part of the Learning Technologies group of companies. LTG is listed on the London Stock Exchange, and it consists of a range of companies, each with their own specialisms in different aspects of learning technologies. So some of our sister companies you'll be familiar with, Rusticy Software, the gatekeepers of the SCORM and XAPI standards, Watershed with their fantastic learning analytics. Also our sister company Leo, who specialize in content creation. And a lot of our experience has been through working with the learning designers in Leo, particularly in developing our Gomo tool. In terms of Gomo itself, our Gomo tool is an entirely cloud-based, mobile-first, responsive HTML5 e-learning authoring tool that allows you to work and collaborate to author and deliver your digital learning content. And with that, we also make sure that it will run from desktops to tablets to smartphones. We also have Gomo delivery and analytics built in. So we've been gaining a lot of experience in terms of how you use analytics to feed back into your learning design. And we'll be sharing some of that later on in this presentation. In terms of our customer base, we've been fortunate enough to work with a range of organizations, both big and small, so small production houses creating content for larger organizations, and also the internal L&D departments of larger organizations, such as the ones that you can see here. So we'll be looking at the 6 steps to e-learning authoring success, sharing with you our experience, hoping to give you some tips and tricks and how to make the most of your journey in terms of adopting an authoring tool and working with your budget, how you introduce a new tool in the best way, some tips for content creation, and then also this really important area about reviewing and testing and measurement and tracking. So Simon, over to you for our first poll.
Absolutely. So as we were just intimated earlier, we're going to have all of these polls available to you. So if you could have a look at this for us, please. The question around this is, how much of experience delivering e-learning projects do you have? So could you select either no experience at all, that you've delivered a few courses, or perhaps you're already very experienced. So if you could select 1, 2, or 3, none at all, I've delivered a few, or very experienced. This will be really helpful for us identifying the sort of skill set available on the webinar. So just going to give you a few minutes just to give that some thought and answer the question. So again, if you could just give some thought to how much experience you've had previously when delivering e-learning projects. And try your best just to fit it into 1, 2, or 3. Excellent, thank you very much. So we can see we have quite a nice split here. We have an amount of people here that have had no experience at all, and that's absolutely fine because we'll be covering this from beginners to experts. Also, we have, again, pretty much 40% split with you've delivered a few courses, and we also have a nice share of very experienced users on this webinar today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, everyone. So we hope that whatever your level of experience, that you're going to find something useful in today's webinar. Particularly if those of you in the very experienced category, we hope that some of the things we'll be saying will really resonate with you. But please do share your own experiences to contribute to this webinar, because I'm sure you've got some great tips and tricks that you can share with people who are maybe less experienced. So first thing that we want to look at here is about defining your needs. So before you actually adopt any kind of tool and start content creation, the important thing is actually to have a look at just what your needs are. And the first step of that is about defining your audience. So what are your learners all about? And the first thing about is where are your learners based? That if you've got an international base of learners, you're going to need to make sure that that you'll be able to deliver those wherever they happen to be. Another important point to consider before you even start is about languages. Are you just going to be delivering your courses in a single language, such as English, or is it going to be important to be able to deliver your content in multiple languages? And within those multiple languages, is our right to left languages going to be important as well? Because you need to be able to look at that before your tool selection, because if multiple languages and right to left languages are going to be really key to you, you need to make sure that you're selecting a tool which is going to support that. The other thing here is about how are your learners going to access the learning. Gone are the days that for those of us who've been involved in this area for a long time, of you go to a separate computer-based training room and you sit in front of a monitor to do your learning. People are expecting to be able to get to the learning on any device wherever they happen to be, and you need to be looking at that device range early on. Also, what are the working patterns? That if people are using mobile devices, does that mean they're accessing your learning while they're traveling? Consider things like the bandwidth constraints as well. If they're going to be trying to access your content on really slow connections, or maybe on connections which are going to run up costs on their cellular data. And really important here is about special access requirements. So here we're looking at accessibility in the US 508 compliance, or more generally WCAG guidelines. So are you going to be able to need to support screen readers? That are you going to be able to deliver your content so it can be used with keyboard only? And if that is going to be significant for you, and increasingly it is, particularly within companies delivering for government organizations and for within government departments, then you really need to consider that right up front and make sure that the tool you select is going to meet your accessibility requirements. And also, let's have a look about defining your actual audience here in terms of the content pipeline. So how are you actually going to produce this content? That if you're just a single person delivering content out to clients. It might be enough just to have a desktop-based tool that you actually install on your computer. But if you want to have learning designers in different locations around the world, you really need to be thinking of a cloud-based solution. Also, look at how many licenses you need. That it might be tempting to buy lots and lots of licenses for absolutely everyone, but we'll be having a look at maybe how you can adjust that to your budget and the best way to roll out the licenses in our next section. One of the big things can be about visual design skills. It's great if you've got in-house graphic designers, but in particular, if you want to incorporate subject matter specialists, then something that can really help to focus and ensure consistency of the design is looking for a tool which allows you to have brand templates. So your designers don't have to worry about brand colors and fonts and logos and so on. That can really enforce brand compliance, but also really speed up development. So check that with your tool. So obviously what's important about what are your learning team's design skills here. So do you have an experience of not only creating content, but also looking at data analytics that you can feed back into your learning design? So if you do, then you really want to have a look at a tool that's going to provide you with detailed analytics data, in particular XAPI, and we'll be having a look at that later on. And also, let's have a look at the output. So you need to upfront define your output. Again, we've mentioned about making sure that it's mobile friendly. You need to make sure that it's fully responsive, that you're not having to design the content for desktop, then create the tablet version, and then the smartphone version, because people are accessing it on different devices. Make sure your tool is responsive. Look at the different media types. About with video, are you going to need captioning? Are you going to need transcripts in there, particularly for accessibility? And what access do you have to video libraries already? Also, what kind of learning do you want to deliver? Is e-learning going to be your primary method of delivery, or are you looking for a more blended approach where it's going to support classroom training? Look at assessment. What kind of assessment do you want to actually gather from your learning content? Is it simply pass, fail, and a score, or do you want to have more complex methods of assessment than that? And what do you need to measure? Again, is it just the score, or do you need to be able to measure the whole learner journey so that you can actually see how your learning is being used? And from that stems the whole thing of looking at your whole learning ecosystem. What do you have already? What it sounds a simple question, but it can trip you up later. You need to look at, in particular, what learning management systems do you have? Do you have a learning record store? Do you have a learning experience platform? What are the actual standards that those platforms are working to? And then make sure that your tools are going to work seamlessly with that. And also look at what you want from a partnership from the tool vendor that you're going to partner with. That really here, you don't just want to be sold a tool, you're investing heavily, not only financially, but in your time as well with this. So you want to make sure that there's a good fit, that you feel comfortable with your tool provider. And they should have the expertise. And my advice here would be make sure that they're actually asking questions of you, because that can really help in this whole definition phase of your journey. So just to recap here, that you need to define your audience, define your output, go into depth about what you've got already with your learning ecosystem, and then also then define what you're looking for in a vendor partnership. So Simon, just before we move on there to the next section, do we have any questions that are relevant to this particular section?
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, we certainly do. There seems to be a reoccurring question around future-proofing. So the question I have here is, what is your advice for future-proofing your content when there's so many new mobile devices constantly being released?
Well, that is a huge headache for all of us. I, for one, used to get really excited when Apple introduced a new screen size and a new iPhone and so forth. And I think a lot of us who've been in this for a while now tend to dread new devices coming out and so forth. The key thing here is to look for a tool which will give you responsive and adaptive content that it will automatically adjust to any screen size, so you don't have to have sleepless nights because you know that there's a new device coming out that suddenly your learners will expect you to support. So from the start, just make sure that whatever you create is future-proof by the fact that it will always run on any screen size.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's just quickly move on here. So let's have a look at here. So we're going to be looking at working to your budget. Now, it might seem strange that we're talking about the benefits of starting small as a tool provider, but we've seen instances where starting big isn't really a good thing. Because what can happen here is that you decide that this is the right tool for us, we're going to go all out for this, and you purchase loads of licenses, and you just expect everybody to pick up the tool and start producing brilliant e-learning content straight away. One of the problems there is that you can have excess licenses that go unused because nobody quite gets the time to actually get acquainted with the tool. And also you'll find that those people who do get to know the tool, the champions, and Simon will be talking about more about that in a moment, that their knowledge gets spread too thinly. They're trying to support far too many people. And also that your onboarding training can be forgotten very quickly. So our advice here would be, yeah, start small, but with a plan for how you're going to roll this out to grow the license pool and grow the experience in your organization. So in terms of cost saving as well, in addition to looking at the number of licenses, just have a look at the whole idea about reuse as well, that the things that you start to create, make sure that they're useful enough that people who are coming on board later can learn from that, that they can reuse the content that you first start creating. Also, just don't pay more for a large image library, for example. You'll probably find that, particularly in a large organization, you already have a marketing department with a huge library of approved stock imagery that you'll be able to draw upon, also videos and audio files and so forth. That check what you have in-house. Also check what's available to use for free as well. There are now some great libraries out there that you can use royalty-free, even in a commercial situation. Okay, we've got two key tips here in terms of false economies. The first thing is don't skimp on training. You need to get at least your core team up and running, no matter how easy the tool is to pick up. Don't just think of, because you've had experience with other tools, that you can just in effect just wing it and almost make it up as you go along. It is well worth the investment in that training. And also consider investing in the actual time, not just for the initial training, but also to give people time to actually use that. Where we see things going really wrong is where you don't give people enough time to practice after the training. And by the time they do have time to try the tool, they've forgotten all about the training. The other thing is about themes. I referenced earlier about the custom style sheets. If your tool offers that, it's well worth investing in the time and effort to make sure that you've got a fully on-brand style template, or what we call a theme in Gomo, that it will really reward you later on. And also the fact that stakeholders want to see early successes. So with the right training, with the right nice visual styling through your theme or style template, you can make sure that the first things you produce are really useful and look great. After that, then we can have a look at just growing your budget. So here you're looking at, okay, how do you begin to get something that's going to get buy-in, both from management and from other departments, so you can begin to roll it out. And again, here, that the key thing could be to focus on something that's actually specific to your organization. So don't just choose something where you could just buy that content off the shelf. Find something that's specific to your organization where there's a real need. And with that, it acts as this really good example for how you can then get buy-in to begin a rollout to other people, to your subject matter specialists. And also then that you can then apply that learning to the future projects as well, and just continue to grow it. So when you're working to your budget, then just make sure that you can start off small, get something to wow your learners, get that kind of buy-in, and then you can begin to see how you can expand and roll that out, and make sure you get ample training and focus on that whole on-brand look of even the very first thing that you produce. So before we move on, I hand over to Simon. Simon, can we just check whether we have any further questions there?
We certainly do, Hugh. We have a couple of great questions. The first one I'll start with, we have a question about licenses and logins. So in terms of buying licenses and logins, this is around GOMO. Would you be able to clarify what the difference is typically between a license, which might be a desktop tool, and having access to a license and a login with respect to GOMO?
Yes, certainly. Yes, so the difference between a sort of desktop tool and a cloud-based tool is, with a desktop tool, you have to manage the actual license, typically a license key that you install it on your desktop computer, and then if you want somebody else to use that license, then you have to transfer that somewhere else, and quite often that happens just when that particular person is on vacation and you can't get to the license key. With a cloud-based tool, it gives you a lot more flexibility that you can either have logins which are specific to an individual, or what some of our customers do is create generic logins like training user 1 and training user 2, so that you can begin to share those around if you only have occasional usage, or you have people in different time zones that they might, we've seen it where they share licenses there as well. So that would be my tip there.
Thank you, Hugh. And just a second one we have here, which is obviously quite ambiguous, but a great question, that with working to your budget, what would be your top tip to success?
That's a good one. I would say, in terms of success, invest the time in training and onboarding for the tool. That just get everybody up to speed, and also make sure you're investing the time to make sure that they can actually practice afterwards, and build that into your budget, not just the actual cost of training, but the cost of the time for people to actually put that into practice immediately afterwards.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hugh.
Thanks, Simon, and I'll hand over to you for step 3, introducing a new tool.
Excellent. Thank you. So yes, step 3, introducing a new tool. As we all understand here, it's human nature to be attached to old methods and tools. So when we're trying to introduce any new piece of software, particularly learning software, it can be slow for people to embrace that. But we have to showcase that the benefits of moving to a new piece of software, they're not always necessarily obvious. So ensuring that the team are supported through the entire process of purchasing it, but also nonetheless, we still have to be prepared to do some work to demonstrate those benefits to the wider business, which is what Hugh had picked up earlier on. We have to ensure we can showcase that and visualize that. So what I'm going to do here is cover 6 steps that will help you create the best possible first impressions, to ensure that perception is the one that you're trying to achieve, and to keep your content creators and learners from falling back to old habits. So ensure that your needs have been mapped. As we referenced there in terms of kind of onboarding and planning and giving time, this is critical because if we have needs that haven't been mapped, it can be disastrous when trying to introduce any new piece of software because inevitably they'll lead to unmanaged expectations of how things should be worked. There'll be preconceived ideas that have not been fulfilled, and that will just create frustrations which are completely avoidable should we map effectively and give that time at the start. And we want to avoid at all costs any sort of negative first impressions when introducing new tools, because it becomes very difficult to turn around later on. And one of the ways I like to introduce a new tool to a business is to have it supported by what I call as a champion. I've had other businesses call these as e-learning friends, but in essence, this is an individual who becomes an expert for the software. And alongside their normal job role, perhaps within e-learning, they work to improve and support that positive behavior through the initial onboarding period and far beyond that. They become that expert, that point of contact for staff who need that support with the new software. And they're that point of liaison also for the vendor, which ensures that that communication and understanding around the needs is constantly up to date. And another key message here around a champion is that if we have a champion that moves on and moves department or moves business, ensure you have the succession planning in place to identify and empower a new champion whilst managing the handover also to the vendor so that there's no drop off in terms of delivery and quality and support to yourself. Obviously, I understand here we're talking about a champion. A product, a typical champion is something like an account owner, someone with a higher level of technical ability, but really critical that they're good at communicating those technical findings to others and also back within your software provider, your vendor. They could be a manager, a supervisor, a team, but also it could be a particular individual, as Hugh's identified earlier on. It could be that it's just a single license holder. So they by default become that champion and that also point of contact with the vendor. But even if that is the case, it's still incredibly important to manage that relationship with your vendor and ensure that everything has been mapped in terms of your needs. But if you are a larger team and you start off with a particular champion, it's really important that they start to cascade that knowledge throughout the team, because over time, they can work to create further champions and obviously improve the efficiency, productivity, and relationship that you have with your vendor. Account for staff's attachment to old software. And this is partly creating new habits, behavioral change management. What we must never assume is that everybody is just going to jump to the next tool. We have to support them throughout that process. And my suggestion and recommendation around that is work closely with your vendor, collaborate with them to ensure that you can put together a custom onboarding process so that all of your staff that are picking up this new piece of software, you understand what their needs are, how it's going to currently impact them and their current workflow. So we ensure that all the current tasks can be mapped to the new software, ensure that users feel like they're going to be able to achieve or particularly exceed those expectations in terms of what they were doing before and what they'll be able to do utilizing the new tool. Don't prioritize similarity between old and new over finding your new solution. Ensure that what you're doing is identifying the new tool and mapping that against the needs moving forwards so you can achieve new and improved outputs. Like moving from a fixed desktop screen to a responsive mobile, that can be a big conceptual hurdle for some. But if your tool is adaptive and responsive and multi-device, then that is something that you can already sell as a benefit to your learning designers and show them the benefit of that improved workflow and efficiency. And that feeds in very nicely into showcasing the benefits of the new tool, we have to be showcasing visually the benefits of what it is. So work with your vendor to provide examples, to show people how it can look, help them to reverse engineer. And there are great reasons then for the new solution, because it's beyond just the learning design teams. You want to show the business why you're making that move. Don't just wait for your learners to stumble across new features. Ensure that you're receiving that information from your vendor. You can demonstrate the difference and communicate the need for change. You can focus on showing them what they couldn't achieve before, again, with help from your vendor. Showing them what they can do now. And as I keep mentioning, ensure that you visualize that. And it's all about reinforcing that positive behavior. This is something that Hugh has referenced as well, and I can't emphasize this enough, and that is give everyone enough time to learn the tool. Staff need time, new users need time to learn how to make best use of the software, how to create what was created previously, and then take it to the next step. It's critical that they get a good balance between training and practical application to reinforce those new habits, to reinforce that learning. Ensure that you're checking in with your users 2 or 3 weeks into that relationship, but also make sure the vendor's doing that in collaboration with you, because what we don't want to do is revert back to old methods and old habits when introducing something new, trying to achieve those new goals. And I completely understand that every team is subject to time pressures and are not always preventable, but we can minimize the effect of time pressures by ensuring that we understand what the future developments are from our vendors, and also help to understand what innovations are coming so that you can stay on top of things. So if you have a complete understanding of that roadmap and what that's going to bring to your learning designers and how that's going to improve the learning outcomes, that's something, if you have an awareness of it 2 to 3 months in advance, you can start to plan more effectively for that. And that's to measure the success of your introduction. Properly measuring that adoption rate is not just a simple matter of checking the usage in metrics, how many people are using it, how they're using it, and what the outcome is. Because those sort of stats otherwise won't tell you whether the behaviors that you've taught are making users' lives easier. It won't guarantee that they're actually using the tool just because they have to use it. Introducing that new solution, you have to ensure that you're actually looking at what the end result is and talking to your staff to ensure that you're capturing the experiences of the new tool, and encourage the sharing and collaboration that's a result of building those new courses. And also feed that information back to your vendor. Vendors want to know how to improve the tools, how to improve the communication, how to ensure that you can build the best possible content with the tool. So promote those sort of discussions, but make sure, whether it's through your champion, you have that vehicle and that method of communication available so that you can not only provide that information, but you can receive information back in terms of how that's going to be implemented, whether it's going to go onto a roadmap, or whether there's going to be a continuous conversation to develop something new. So feedback is absolutely critical. So if we just have a quick recap in terms of introducing a new tool, key messages here: ensuring that your needs have been mapped, ensuring that we're enforcing that positive behavior to create new habits, collaboration, and share. Have that champion for your tool, have that point of contact that not only helps internally, also helps between the relationship internally and the vendor. Account for staff's attachment to old software. Give staff the time required to become comfortable, confident, and embrace the new software. We have to empower them to get the most out of the output. Showcase the benefits. Work with your vendor to ensure that you are showing the best use of the tool. Give everyone, as we've mentioned, that time and measure the success of your introduction. Measure that by the output. Get feedback from your learners. Get feedback from your designers. Ensure that's captured and ensure that's represented and presented back to your vendor. So I'm just going to have a look to see what questions. Hugh, have there been any come through?
Yes, Simon, we've had a couple coming through
Okay,
here. So, this one from Nick is about how do you identify a champion?
excellent. That's a great question. So there isn't one answer to this, but from my experience of identifying a champion, it is typically an individual who is effective at communicating within the business and within your team, has a natural passion to learn new tools, are very excited about that and wants to share that information. There could be a manager, there could be a supervisor of a team. But the key here is ensuring they've got those transferable skills with technology and that they can communicate that on a level which is effective with other members of the team. And then empowering that champion to cascade that information on to create new champions. Now, there's no limit to how many champions you can have. The more people with this expertise, more people as a go-to point of contact, the better internally for answering all of the questions required to build beautiful learning content. And obviously you can have your main point of contact as a champion back with your vendor who can capture all of that information and feed it two ways.
Thanks, Simon. And also, just we've had another question from David um, about GOMO facilitating groups in terms of communities of practice to support champions. And this might be something that we need to sort of take offline with David to go into more depth, but thinking possibly
Absolutely.
around what's happening in the upcoming GOMO Academy and so on.
Yeah, I mean, we can give a little bit of insight into that for David, but obviously happy to take this offline as well with yourself. We are looking, we talk about roadmap and what I was encouraging there was those conversations that happen with your vendor. But in terms of what we're doing, yes, beyond your typical knowledge base and your online sort of text-based learning resources, we are looking at a couple of other methods around engagement and learning, which will support champions to cascade that knowledge. We have what will be a video-based learning platform called GOMO Academy, and that's where you'll have all bite-sized learning and blended learning resources that can again be cascaded throughout a team to refresh that learning when required. And also, this is simply based on feedback from our existing customers. We are also evaluating the option for community forums, which again will provide that instant access and instant information for our champions to be empowered.
Great, thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Hugh. So step 4, this leads very nicely in as we were just talking about, extra additions in terms of academies, forums, champions, and so on. Now, content creation. Obviously, this is the critical step to visualizing the goals that we're trying to achieve with our learning methodologies. And learning designers, they now have a huge variety of assets and options when creating their courses. Every project must perform a balancing act between engagement and relevance. The temptation to fill a course full of innovative assets or anything whizzy just because it looks great has to be weighted against the possibility that you're making something too distracting. And in this section, I'd like to cover some of those content expectations and how we can work to deliver these through design choices and tool selection. So what do learners expect in 2020? What we'll cover now is what we expect at this moment, but as you appreciate with this ever-changing landscape, we are moving at such an incredible rate that these expectations are always moving. And this is where I'd quickly reference back to when I was talking about access to roadmap and information from your vendor. It's a great idea to identify what your learners expect, what your designers expect, and how that can potentially fit in to future developments with your vendor. But in terms of what we expect right now with content in 2020, as a HTML5, is the coding language that underpins almost all web-based content. Anything that's possible in web content at the moment can be possible within HTML5 based e-learning. And perhaps at some level, it's expected because we're constantly introduced to this information via all sorts of devices. So those expectations are constantly being built upon. And they fall into two key areas, the aesthetics and the accessibility, how it functions. So modern web aesthetics, people want content that has the design sensibilities of modern web standards, as mentioned. We expect that high resolution imagery, that high definition video is a given right now. People expect that, and they expect that via whichever device that they're using. And this is something that can become a problem if you're still uploading entire courses via a SCORM package, because it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. But there are many ways now to alleviate that potential challenge when increased file sizes become more standard. We can look at things like a SCORM wrapper, where we send a tiny file out to a learner management system, and it's dynamically linked and it's stored within the cloud. But also it's selecting images and videos carefully, making sure that whatever we put in there as part of our design is well considered. Don't put content in there for the sake of it. We have to ensure that each asset, each interaction that we put in there has a purpose, that it's there to achieve the learning outcomes and not just to look great. We can achieve the same with just trying to work towards achieving the learning outcomes without any unnecessary distractions. We can have very simple effects that aren't necessarily asset related, subtle effects, things like transitions or parallax scrolling, which was once only a web-based feature, is now available on certain tools. And users expect variation. They want to be engaged with the visuals you put on the screen that have a purpose, but they don't want to see clutter and distraction for the sake of it. And in terms of modern web accessibility, our learners today, they expect to be able to access that website from any device, that e-learning from any device. And whether you achieve this via responsive design or a dedicated mobile app, you should be delivering the same content and features in a way that places the strength of the device type being used. And this approach supports different work habits. Learning content can be worked through by staff who are always on the move and field-based, or those who don't have a dedicated desktop. HTML5 also provides a necessary hook for assistive technologies, screen readers, commonly used by our learners and users that have visual impairments. They rely on correctly formatted metadata to understand pages correctly. So ensure that this is possible through the tool that you're building your e-learning content with. Fundamentals that shouldn't be overlooked. As we almost highlighted in the previous slide, we have to ensure that beyond how modern media shapes our expectations, that our workforce has seen plenty of e-learning and they have a sense of what is effective. But we recommend particular focus is on your content being relevant and concise, and this is a common thread here. Refine your content to ensure its message is as effective as it can be in the little or the smallest time possible, because we need to keep people engaged throughout that learning journey. And if it's like working with video, ensure that that video has a tight script for your subject matter experts to learn, so that you're not putting out a lengthy video where it's not required. Put out a short video, micro learning in style, so that people receive the information when they need it within the smallest amount of time. Being clear in that purpose. The learning objectives should be clear for the user from the beginning. Keep the content straightforward and focus on those learning objectives. That feeds back into being relevant and concise. Ensure that everything within that build has a purpose. And if you need to have examples of that, reach out to your vendor, ask for those examples where we have great learning methodologies and how that's been applied in different scenarios, whether that be in a reflective learning scenario, in a bite-sized learning scenario, or perhaps it's just going to be in a competency-based assessment. Visually on brand, learners are more attuned to what their branding content looks like than most people realize. They instantly recognize when things look off, and then it feels less professional, less important. This is critical when having a look at identifying how do you keep brand compliance with your builds. Have a look where tool providers can provide those themes that are brand compliant, that when a designer comes in, they can use that theme and all they need to do is focus on building that beautiful content without the concerns about whether it's compliant. Interactivity. Obviously, we have full-blown VR, AR, XR type experiences now and serious games, but they're not appropriate for every learning project. There should be a degree of interactivity, and you can use that through subtle knowledge checks. So reflection, reflective learning, have that through your course, and perhaps it's a blended learning package. Perhaps you do use VR and AR to a degree, but perhaps you want to have your assessment with e-learning. Perhaps you want to use e-learning in collaboration with classroom-based learning. And this goes back to where Hugh was mentioning about your learning ecosystem. It's really important to identify what that learning journey looks like. What are the methods of learning? And then how are you going to deliver, capture, measure, and improve that process over time in collaboration with your vendor? So how can you make that process of content creation easier and more efficient? As mentioned, most leading HTML5 authoring tools, they'll take care of a lot of the aesthetic and accessibility elements for you. They'll largely allow you to concentrate on building the content, but you must evaluate that when identifying your new tool. You shouldn't have to expect your designers to code responsive layouts or flick between separate versions of your course. You should be able to now build your content within one tool, have it be responsive, adaptive, and look beautiful on all devices with the single build. Tools also have an important to play with facilitating collaboration. And a cloud-based tool makes it extremely easy and efficient at having multiple authors and reviewers working on the same course simultaneously. Whereas previously, if you're on a desktop type tool per license, I typically wouldn't be able to see what Hugh would be building versus what I would be building, where on a cloud-based tool, it's very much like your modern office type systems, whereby you can see where the other person is, review feedback, proofing, and deliver based on the feedback within the collaboration tools on your software. Also a library of pre-configured assets, such as screen templates. They can act, as a real kind of shortcut to developing that content that you're trying to achieve through your learning outcomes. And a tool whereby you not only have a theme that ensures you're brand compliant, but also be able to set up those themes at a top level and have the course structure and templates at the top level will allow your designers to get started far quicker. So if they know they're going to be doing a competency-based course with formal assessment, they can take that from the template and use that as their starting point. Likewise, it may be just a reflective learning session, and they could use that again. So having that built at a top level really supports positive behavior, reinforcing those new habits, and also creating that look and feel and better learning outcomes. So just to conclude that, ensuring your content continues to get results, that's what I'm reinforcing constantly here. We have to ensure that all of this is setting you up for e-learning success. And if your engagement, if that's slowly dropping off, and Hugh will cover some of this with your analytics, it's best to have a look and have an open mind to go back and rethink whether actually some of the choices in terms of that instructional design were the most effective choices. And things like XAPI allows us to drill in to a much more granular level to understand those pathways and movements throughout your e-learning journey. And one thing, as we mentioned from the start, that we can definitely say together is that learners' expectations, they're always going to continually change. And ensuring that we map that expectation, we monitor that journey throughout the course, we can always ensure that what we're doing is communicating and delivering the best possible experience with your e-learning content. But Hugh, do we have any questions coming in?
Simon, we're a bit tight for time, but I think we can squeeze in one here about one from Kelly about where do you think microlearning fits in with this?
Great question. I'll be as quick as possible because I could probably speak on a webinar about microlearning. But in essence, microlearning is also referenced as bite-sized learning, and it's really designed to engage learners within 3 to 5 minutes worth of learning, and it's for typically a specific learning outcome. So it could be for refresher training, it could be very much about how to do X, Y, and Z and what was the result of that, but it can also be put into formal training if that's required. But typically it's a designer's choice. So your tool will allow and provide you to build something that was only 3 to 5 minutes worth of learning, and likewise up to 45 minutes to an hour. But microlearning is all about that 3 to 5 minute, very much in that YouTube-esque learning experience. It's something also we're building into the academy, as mentioned earlier. But it's critical, if you are looking at microlearning, that your tool allows it to work as expected on mobile devices, because that's where a lot of microlearning is experienced. Thank you, Hugh.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, we've just got a couple more steps to look at, and the next one that I want to take you through is the really, really important step, so I'm sure you'll all appreciate, about the review and testing, because you've created this great content and now you need to get it out to your learners, and it can be tempting just to immediately throw it out there, but it's really important, this step of reviewing and testing here. So we're going to have a look at just some of the common testing oversights that we tend to come across again and again, because you need to be checking, because when it goes out there live, it can be really difficult that if your learners have a bad experience on their particular device, then it really damages the perception of your learning right from the start. So the first thing is, the most common thing is failing to test in different end user environments. That this can mean the whole range of devices. So there are so many different devices out there, and this really comes back to your original analysis of your ecosystem, that are there specific devices that you know that your learners are going to be accessing the content on? Because you can have a fantastic responsive tool that's going to take care of reflowing layouts for the different screen size, but you really need to test on some key devices as well. Don't just rely on some kind of simulation. Try it on those actual devices, just in case you need to make some adjustments to your actual learning content. The other thing here, obviously, is browsers. That there are still a lot of browsers out there, and don't just rely on the fact that you happen to be using the latest version of Chrome or Internet Explorer or Safari or whatever it might be. We still come across, and I'm sure you have, a lot of environments where people are still using really old versions of Internet Explorer, or even the big thing that can trip you up is a new version of Internet Explorer that's been set to in a compatibility mode, so it's behaving like an old version. So always make sure that you know what browsers you're testing on and what browsers your users are going to have. The same with operating systems as well. You know, which level of the operating system can you expect to find on your learners' desktops and devices. Also, learning management systems, it's really, really important that if your learners are going to be accessing it through an LMS, actually test on an LMS before you go for launch. It's amazing the difference that you can experience just because it's running from an LMS. It might work fine in your test environment, then it goes onto an LMS and suddenly different things are happening. Also, to test about multiple user journeys, this is where you need to get lots of different people involved, not just the people who've designed the course. Get people who've never used the course to test it, because you might be so used to the logic that you've built in that you don't realize that you've maybe accidentally built in other paths through. So always make sure that you can actually test for those learner journeys. And also, the non-technical aspects. I mean, just check and recheck things like spelling and grammar and the tone of voice to make sure it's consistent. And even just subtleties in spelling, regional differences in spelling. I mean, the classic example we find is if somebody creates a course using British English spelling, and that can just look horrendous to somebody in the United States. Beware of all of those. And also, make sure that you're testing throughout from prototyping onwards. And the key message here that we beg you, please don't leave it to Friday afternoon before your big launch to actually go and start testing. It sounds obvious, but we see it again and again. And also make sure that you've got a test group of people, so not just those involved in building the course. Make sure you've got staging and review tools. Now, this can be difficult if you're just a small organization, but the most successful larger organizations will even have a staging learning management system. So the whole thing can be tested out before it actually goes live. So always make sure that you test the widest possible range of devices, and also if at all possible, as close as you can get to the actual live environment, so you get that confidence for when you go live that everything's going to be great. And I'm just going to, I'm aware that we're a bit pushed for time here, so we'll come back to questions at the end. Because I just want to cover briefly the whole area of measurement and tracking. So you've launched your courses, they look great, you've tested them, they're working beautifully, but you then want to see just how it's being used. That you want to be able to get that kind of analysis, that more and more just having some kind of tracking that says this person did this course and they got this score and they completed it just isn't enough. It might be okay for basic sort of compliance training where all you want to know is that, yes, they've passed it, but really that you want to get a deeper insight into how your learning's being used, that you want to see that whole learner journey. How long did people spend on each screen? Were they just trying to skip through it? Did people give up at a particular screen and didn't come back to it? Did everyone get the same question wrong? Did they all choose the same wrong answer? You can, if you've got that kind of level of detail of analytics, you can then feed it back into your learning design. So again, it's coming back to looking at the tool selection. Is the tool that you're choosing able to deliver that level of detail? And most typically these days, that will mean a tool that will support the XAPI standard, so you can have analytics everywhere, or at the very least that it's going to support SCORM 2004. But again, you need to look at your ecosystem. Do you have a learning management system that supports it? Do you have a separate learning record store that you can be feeding this XAPI statements into? And it goes beyond just measuring, because here that that you're going to find out the detailed way in which your learning is being used. And the great thing about the new standards of XAPI is that you can separate out the actual recording from the LMS. The problem with standards like SCORM 1.2, even SCORM 2004, is it's tied into just the LMS, whereas XAPI, you can separate out that where you're actually recording the data in a separate learning record store and be running your analytics from there. And also, you need to make sure that you know why you want to collect this data. It's very tempting just to gather absolutely everything, but you can end up with so much data that you really can't see the wood for the trees, that it's just sitting there and you're never going to look at it. And then you have a whole nightmare of how to actually manage that. So you need to make sure that you know what you want to capture and that you've got the right tool to be able to analyze that. For example, our sister company Watershed have fantastic analytics dashboards, very visual, for you to be able to understand the data you've collected. And also just make sure about all the basic things about troubleshooting. Common things like you might have the wrong password to connect to your learning records store. Suddenly you discover that, in fact, you thought you were collecting data, it all seemed to work in the test environment, and then suddenly you don't have your data. And it could be down to something as basic like that. And check about things like whether your learners have consistent connections. Can you check for connectivity? So just to recap, look at what data you can capture in the tool, look at what data you want to capture, and then also look at how you're going to actually analyze that data that you do capture. Do you have a really nice, easy way to be able to visualize the analytics so you can actually make sense of it and feed it into your learning design? So I realize that we've gone slightly over time there. So I think, Simon, I think that we'll address some of the questions that have come through separately offline. Apologies if we haven't been able to answer your questions in person here. So Simon, over to you just to recap here.
Absolutely. I'll be as quick as possible here. So thank you very much for your time today. Now, if we just quickly recap, we had the 6 steps here. We had defining your needs, working to your budget, introducing a new tool, content creation, review and testing, measurement and tracking. What we've also done is just drop in the handouts within your window here on GoToMeeting. You'll see we've put in the GOMO ebook, 6 Steps to Learning. You should just see that here. If you download that, that expands and reinforces a lot of the message that Hugh and myself have been delivering today. So you can just see it there. And obviously the call to actions here, if you want to have any additional information, use the contact us at gomolearning.com, and Hugh, myself, or another member of the team will happily answer all of the questions. But also, just to expand on what Hugh had mentioned, we will be picking up the questions here and reaching out to the audience. So thank you very much for your time today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you to you, Hugh, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.